I was on an equestrian team throughout middle school with about 9 other girls. My coach's name was Deborah, and one of the most awesome things about Deborah was that she'd always take our teams on reward trips or events. Trips included outings such as movies, water park dates, or just barn sleepovers. This particular trip was a trail ride overnight. We were ecstatic as trail overnights were only a summer thing, and it was one of the first ones of the year. Basically, a trail overnight was a weekend that we would go on a 3-day-long trail ride. We'd pack a bag or two, meet up on Friday morning at the stable, load up our horses and bags into the 3 trailers, and be on our way. That was exactly how it happened this particular trip. Everything went exactly as it should have, and we set off to a trail near the Sleeping Bear Dunes as I live in rural Michigan. Things got odd a few hours into the trip. We had all left at about 7 in the morning, so that left us with plenty of daylight to do fun stuff after we got settled into the campsite. Deb had us all saddle up to go along the Lakeshore Trail. Once everyone was in the saddle, we set off on a narrow, single-file-only trail that wound through some woods and eventually would lead us to an overlook of the beach. I was completely in my zone. My horse, Aries, was not. It was like he and a few other horses were sensing something that nobody else did. But we chalked it up to being in a new place that we had never camped before. Being that Aries was a Mustang, I thought maybe his wild instincts were kicking in after a few years of being domesticated as well. At about 7 o'clock that evening, while Deb and the stable hand Carla cooked up hot dogs and the rest of us had to come back from swimming, I decided to take Aries out for a quick trot and a loop around the campsite in hopes to calm him down. I grabbed my helmet and mounted up, not bothering to grab reins or saddle up, and just tied the lead rope to the other side of his halter. The ride went how I expected it to, with Aries acting up. Although this time his behavior was different. He didn't just seem agitated, he seemed distressed, like something was really scaring him. I looked around and couldn't see a thing. No deer, no bears, no other horseback riders or mountain bikers or anything. I decided to go down a little trail that would wind back up at the campsite after about 5 minutes rather than just going in a loop. This is where it hit the fan. We had been going for about 2 minutes on this little trail when I started feeling funny, like we were being watched. I turned around and nobody was there. At one point of the trail, we came across a big boulder, and this was where Aries stopped completely. No amount of nudging or encouragement budged him. He absolutely refused to go any further. I slid off his back and tried pulling him to no avail. That's when I noticed where his eyes were focused. He wasn't looking at me, but over my shoulder. Slowly, I turned around and saw a tall, dark figure about 50 yards away, maybe less, standing ahead of us on the trail, not moving, even though I'm sure he heard us. I didn't know what to do. Was he a hiker? It was obviously a man, but he had no pack, no bike, nothing. He was holding something in his hand though. A walking stick, maybe. I didn't want to bother him or go near him as his presence had given me the creeps. I whispered to Aries that we were going back and slowly climbed on. As soon as I was situated and I looked back at the man though, my heart dropped. The figure had turned towards us, watching. I could tell because I could faintly make out the zipper of his jacket. There was no doubt he had seen and heard us, so there was no point in trying to be subtle. I offered a wave, trying to signal I was out of there and wouldn't be a bother. Aries was more than happy to oblige. When I looked back again, my heart dropped even further and I froze. The figure was getting larger. The man was chasing us, running at full speed. I saw what was in his hand, a machete? It couldn't be, but it sure looked like some kind of weapon. I said Aries' name loudly in fear, and he knew what I wanted. He kicked into overdrive as the man had caught up to about 10 yards away from us. Mustangs are fast, and Aries was no exception. That made hanging on without a saddle a bit difficult, but I somehow knew that if I fell, my life was over. And just my luck, I did fall. Aries had put some distance between us and the man to where I could no longer hear or see him, but it didn't take long for the machete guy to come within hearing range. The man came up over the hill of the trail and spotted me immediately. I knew I was doomed. The man started towards me, and before I could bolt, I heard the thundering sound of hooves speeding in my direction. The man, although I couldn't see his face beneath the hood of his jacket, I could tell he was looking behind me. I turned too and had to dive out of the way. Aries was speeding towards the man in like a freight train. I couldn't believe what I saw. Before the guy could dive out of the way, Aries struck him with full force and trampled him, making the guy yell out in pain. He lay there limply, more than likely a bone or two was broken. Aries was big for a Mustang, and being hit and run over by any horse isn't going to leave you without injury. Aries disappeared over the hill for a second, then came back and ran the man over a second time. He stopped long enough for me to scramble onto his back, and we sped to the campsite. I told Deb and the rest of the group that we needed to call the police and get the hell out of there. As soon as I told Deb, she had us pack our stuff up and get in the trailer and trucks while she called the police. They didn't take too long to arrive, as there were usually some scouting around the area we were in. I told them everything that had happened, and that the man may still be laying where we had left him because Aries had trampled him pretty badly. We didn't stick around long enough to find out, but we learned that the guy I had encountered had previously been arrested for assault with intent to kill. How he had gotten into the woods, I'll never have any clue. I do know that I owe my life to my horse, as I wouldn't be here to tell this story had I not been with him. People say horses are dumb animals, but I think Mustangs are different. I think if Aries had not been wild before, he wouldn't have been able to recognize the threat. Anyway, that's my story. If there are any fellow riders out there, or even just hikers or mountain bikers, whatever you might do on the trail, I recommend you don't go do it alone.
Years ago when I was in 2nd grade, I'm 22 now, my parents one morning finally felt confident in allowing me to stay home from school by myself and stay home without a babysitter until they came home. That morning my father gave me a house key, showed me the emergency numbers in the yellow book, and gave me instructions on what to do if stupid things happen like the house catching on fire. After school that day I came home, put the key in the door and walked into my house. I felt free, and I felt privileged that I was finally a big boy, and that I could now be on my own at home. Needless to say, I kinda got caught up in the moment, and ate tons of ice cream while watching Terminator on VHS, since my parents would never let us watch anything other than PG-13. Around 5 that day, I heard the doorbell ring. My dad told me to never answer the door by myself, even if they were home. I walked to our family room where I could get a good view of who was out there. Maybe my dad was just getting a package or something. He did always enjoy ordering things online. I saw a middle-aged man standing in a dark blue jacket that I've never seen before. He rang the doorbell again, and I expected him to leave after no one answered. After a third ring, I saw him walk down the steps and I assumed he was leaving. I went back to watching Terminator when I noticed something outside my kitchen window. The man was in our backyard for some odd reason. I felt scared for my life since some stranger was on my property. I ran under the kitchen table and grabbed the cordless phone from the counter and proceeded to call my dad's work number. My dad answered, and I exclaimed how a strange man was in the backyard and was now proceeding to try and open the sliding door. My dad told me to stay where I was and to call the neighbors. He would call 911. I told my dad I loved him, and he said he would call me immediately after he called 911. Before I could call my neighbor, the man was able to somehow open our family room window. I feared for my life and ran to the bathroom and locked the door and called our neighbors. After 30 seconds, I hear my neighbor running through our house, shouting my name to see if I was okay. She said that she saw no one in the house, and we stayed in the bathroom until the police arrived. The police conducted their investigation and told us that they found some fingerprints that matched a recently released convict who was previously in jail for breaking into homes. After that day, my parents did not leave me alone without a babysitter until I went to high school.
I thought the scraping sound I'd been hearing inside the walls was just rats. I didn't think much of it. My house was old and wooden, located by a small forest. Bugs and vermin were a bit of a given, but I bought the place at such a low price, it seemed almost a desperate plea for someone to take it off the realtor's hands. I put traps around the house, sprinkled rat poison in pods, even had pest control stop by. The scratching continued weeks later. I ignored it the best I could. That slow scraping in the boards. Every night, The sound of something raking its claws along the insides of my home traveled in the air, almost similar to a knife sliding along a cutting board. The scratching would travel from room to room, taking its time to make sure nothing went untouched. Finally, it would start directly behind the headboard of my bed, a dragging that made me grit my teeth. Even still, I pretended nothing was wrong, until one morning I awoke to a frenzied scratching in my living room, interspersed with loud thuds. This was accompanied by a panicked wailing, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I skipped calling animal control. I phoned the police instead. It didn't take long to find the issue. They pulled a small boy out of the wall as I stared in shock. He was covered in dirt with wild eyes that twitched with each shake of his body. I explained to the officer I thought it was rats that had been pestering me for weeks. Luckily, he believed me. I called to check on the boy later that day. There wasn't much to tell. He'd been delusional from hunger and panic. I was amazed he hadn't been affected by any attempts to get rid of what I thought were rats. He was able to speak, but it hadn't made much sense to anyone. He was convinced there was a thing in the walls that had kept him there. He said it needed him because it had been hungry. Everyone thought he was been hallucinating. I felt sorry for him, but glad I could finally rest. That night, I went to bed without a sense of dread. Things were okay, and my phone rang out in the silence. I answered. When I heard the shouts of the officer of the line, from what my brain could piece together, they found out the boy's relatives after calling around. He'd recently been reported missing. He'd only been gone for 2 days. There was no possible way he could have been making those sounds for as long as I had been hearing them. He wasn't the cause. Then, neither were rats. Fear seized my chest as the sound of scratching, slow and taunting, began in the wall beside my head.
On a cold, dark night, around 2 in the morning, a young man and his father sat in a remote 24-hour diner waiting to be served. The older man, who was sadly, slowly going senile, had insisted on going out for some soup. Not having the energy to argue, the son took him out, for at least this way his father would be happy, and then he could get some peace and quiet. The waiter walked over, welcomed them to the diner, and then asked if they were ready to order, to which they replied they were. The waiter recommended for them to try the burgers. Best in the West, he said, with a smile that made their skin crawl. They declined and proceeded to order what they came for. The old man ordered tomato soup, and the son a coffee. When the waiter walked away, the son asked his father if he had thought the waiter looked familiar. Not surprisingly, the father said he had never seen him before. But why? He asked. The son proceeded to tell him that he thought he looked a lot like a man he saw on the news that was wanted for murder in another state, but he could easily be mistaken. This made the father quite uncomfortable, so he told his son to shut up and change the subject. Instead, the son then got up, told his father he was going to the bathroom and would be back in a minute. The father waited and waited. Almost 15 minutes had passed, and his son hadn't returned. He also hadn't seen the waiter again. Where was his son? And where was his soup? Just as he finished asking himself this, the waiter appeared with the soup. "Well, you took your time with that," the old man said. "I'm sorry, sir," said the waiter. "We had some issues in the kitchen." "Where's my son?" the old man asked the waiter. "Oh, I'm sure he's not far. I have a feeling you'll be seeing him really soon." And with this, he placed the bowl down on the table with a smile that would have given anyone the creeps. The old man turned to his soup and then dipped his spoon in to take his first mouthful. As he lifted the spoon, something else came with it. Some glasses. What the hell? He thought to himself. A horrible chill ran through his body when he realized whose glasses they were. His son's. The old man looked across at the waiter and was overcome with rage when he saw the waiter's sickly grin staring back at him. He grabbed a knife, leapt out of his seat, and stabbed the waiter in the chest. The blade went straight through his heart, and while bleeding profusely all over the floor, he died. Right at this moment, the son appeared from the kitchen and screamed at his father, "No! What have you done? It was a prank! We were playing a prank!" The old man couldn't believe what he was hearing. A prank? But he's a... Oh my God, he thought to himself as the reality quickly set in. I've killed him. The father and son had to act quickly. They grabbed the body and decided to stash it in the cool room to buy them some time. They would then clean the floor and disappear as if they had never been there. Perfect, they thought. There were no witnesses and no one to stop them. Well, that's what they thought, until they slid back the door to the cool room and were greeted by a sight so shocking it made both of them wish they were dead. They had disturbed the waiter's brother, hard at work, making meat for burgers. The best in the West, apparently. Not that they would ever know.